So what I will do is give a definition of cumulative effects. I will explain why cumulative effects matter, and then I will go forward into the area in which I believe most cumulative effects will be encountered, that is, in assessing cumulative effects. The definition first. If you look in the literature, you will find many, hundreds, I hesitate to think how many definitions for cumulative effects there are. I will warn you that when academics try to define something, some of their definitions are just crazy. And I will not talk about any of those. I don't even allow myself to talk about those. Some of them are just a little off. And if you want to ask some questions about some of those, maybe we can, but I'm going to stick with what I think is the most widespread definition of cumulative effects. This is a simple one that I developed for the Indigenous Center for Cumulative Effects. And it basically is the one you see on your screen. Think of something that the community values, and that thing will be affected by human developments. And so the cumulative effects on something valued by the community are cumulative effects. And these are common. For example, air quality. If air quality is affected by a lot of things that emit things into the atmosphere, it will be likely a cumulative effect. Water quality is often a cumulative effect. A local herd of moose may be affected by several different developments, and yet it may be very important for getting country food. Those are the kinds of things that are most important. Now, let me stop for a moment, because I need to explain why cumulative effects are so important. And for that, I have a prop here. Rather than give you a theoretical discussion, I'm going to talk about an example. And the example I'm going to talk about is water quality. And I make up a little story to explain things. And so that's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to drink this water. And so in the impact assessment field, we say the level of significance is the water potable? If it's potable, if I can drink it, then it is quite acceptable. But I know that in this stream, in this river that I have frequently visited, I was born and raised in Winnipeg, and so we often went out on the lakes and on the rivers. On this river, there are pollutants, there are effluents that go into the river, but I want to know simply, is it safe to drink the water? I know there are three important sources, one of which is a mine, one is just a small mine, but a mine, one of which is a small town where the mine workers live, and the other is a farm nearby. So I go to the mine and I ask the person in charge, your emissions into the river, do they cause significant adverse effects? And the mine operator says, no, we have been told that our mine has been assessed, and we determined that the effluent would have an adverse effect on the river, but it's insignificant. So I turned to the farmer, and the farmer said, I asked the same question, significant adverse effect on water quality? The farmer says, oh no, we had an expert come in here and assess our runoff, and we determined that our contribution to the river does not cause a significant adverse effect. So I turned to the mayor of the town and I asked the mayor the same question. And the mayor says, oh no, we have monitored the effluent into the river that we release, and it will not cause a significant adverse effect. So I ask you, is it safe to drink the water? And the answer is, you don't know, because, well, the farm doesn't cause a significant adverse effect, and the mine doesn't cause a significant adverse effect, and the town doesn't cause a significant adverse effect. The total effect of the three of them may or may not be significant. And that's why you need to know not the individual project effects, but the cumulative effect. By the way, water is fine. Why do cumulative effects matter? Because, and this is a really important lesson, because the only effects that matter are the total effects, the cumulative effects, not the effects of individual projects. And that's important to know. You keep this in mind, because I will come back later on to stress this. So we now know that cumulative effects are the total effects of all human activities. And we ask now, what do? Well, we take advantage of that knowledge. The only effects that matter are cumulative effects. We take advantage of that when we assess effects. The cumulative effects assessment, then, I break them down into the two most common impact assessment situations, the first of which is assessing a project. As you know, when we propose a new project in Canada or in Quebec or in Labrador or elsewhere, we do an impact assessment for those projects first. And because the only effects that matter are cumulative effects, most of the legislation these days requires the consideration of cumulative effects. We also have regional cumulative effects assessments, and I'll talk about those briefly as well. So, project cumulative effects assessment, as I say, the principle of project impact assessment is to get information that will help governments to make better development decisions. And those governments can be First Nation governments, they can be Government of Canada, the Government of Quebec, Government of Alberta here in Calgary, or others. Help government make better development decisions for proposed projects. And so we do that by saying, now, what do we want to study? You need to study things that are important to the communities and that will be affected by the project. And we call them valued components. We need information about what will happen to these valued components so that we can determine whether the project should be approved or not. All things considered, if all of the valued components that we have will be significantly adversely affected, maybe we don't want that project. If they will be insignificantly affected and the project will provide real benefits for people, then we probably want to approve that project with conditions. Now, we need information about what will happen to these valued components. And because the only effects that matter are cumulative effects, we need to assess not only the project effects, but also the cumulative effects. And we need to determine the significance of them. So here are the what I called in a paper that I published, I think it was 1998. I identified 4 requirements for doing cumulative effects assessment for projects. The first one is to identify the value components affected by the project, what we've always done in the past. We call that scoping in the jargon. We need, now, for those in the olden days, because I've been around for a long time, in the olden days, we used to just look at the project effects. And if we identified a project effect that was insignificant, we would ignore it. We would say, that's insignificant, don't worry about it. But these days, if it's insignificant as a project effect, it might be significant as a cumulative effect. So we keep it around. But if the value component is positively affected, if it's made better by the project, or isn't affected by the project at all, we don't keep it around, we reject it and move on. Second requirement is we need to determine what the other human activities, what effect the other human activities have on that valued component. And we step through that determination for each of the valued components. Now, this is a requirement that is unique to cumulative effects assessment, assessing the cumulative effects. We need to predict the effects on the value component of the project in combination with the other human activities and determine the significance of those effects. And if they're insignificant cumulatively, then we can move on. If they become significant adverse, in the old Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012, the jargon was, if they're likely significant adverse cumulative effects, then we've got to pay attention because we really ought to be trying to mitigate them or manage them. And so the fourth requirement is how to manage the cumulative effects. Now, in the literature, the most challenging problem in cumulative effects assessment is this one, is managing cumulative effects. My good friend, the late Roger Creasy, had a brilliant observation about managing cumulative effects. He said, cumulative effects require cumulative solutions. What that means is, if you've got effects that are caused by, in my water quality example, if you've got effects that are caused by multiple human activities, it's likely that the contributions from several of those human activities need to be managed. And that means if you're looking at a proposed new project, the proponent for that new project may well need to cooperate with the people who operate the existing projects or the proponents for other new projects to cumulatively manage the cumulative effects, to cooperatively manage the cumulative effects. And that is a very important lesson that one needs to pay attention to. Regional cumulative effects assessment is also something that is done routinely. And it's done for slightly different reasons. They're related, but they're different. The first possible reason is to get information that will help the people assessing new projects do a good cumulative effects assessment. It's my understanding federally that there is a regional cumulative effects assessment, a regional assessment being done in Northern Ontario as we speak, with a view to collecting information that will help deal with some other new projects, some mining projects, and perhaps a road project in the area now. That is the one that in the literature is most common. The second possible reason, which I think is actually more common, is to determine how to manage cumulative effects in the region. So, for example, there is an oil pipeline that goes from Alberta to the west coast, and the oil product is put into ships that head off, and those extra ships, as they expand this pipeline, those extra ships will have an adverse effect on the marine system and especially on marine mammals. As a result of doing this project impact assessment, there is a clearly identified need to manage the cumulative effects in the ocean just outside of Vancouver. And how to do that was unclear, but of course you've got not only the shipping, the oil tankers, but you also have other ships in the region. You have other pollutants in the area that are affecting the marine environment, the marine mammals. And so how do you manage those? There was a study that was carried out by what is now called the Canadian Energy Regulator to look at the cumulative effects in the area with a view to managing them. There are several other examples that I'm even told that private sector is doing regional cumulative effects assessments. And others, another example is national parks or provincial parks may do a cumulative effects assessment in the park with a view to planning for the region. What's the existing situation? What are the cumulative effects on the things that matter in the national park? And so those are the things that are focused on in regional cumulative effects assessment. Now, if I can take you back to the requirements here, the difference in how you carry out the project cumulative effects assessment and the regional cumulative effects assessment is that you don't have a project as the base. So in the 4 requirements, the first requirement is now off the table because there's not a designated project that needs to be the focus for the cumulative effects. But the determining what are the human activities, determining their effect, their cumulative effect on the various important valued components, and how to manage these is on the table. And you do that in doing regional cumulative effects assessments. Next, I have 3 slides that provide more technically sophisticated explanations of cumulative effects in the context of cumulative effects assessment. There are 3 of them. They are all the same. The first one is from the Impact Assessment Act of Canada. Effects that are likely to result, forgive the jargon in here, but it really means the same thing as the other 2. The effects that are likely to result from the designated project, from the proposed project, in combination with other, they call them physical activities, with other human activities that have been or will be carried out. So past, present, future. That's basically the definition that I used. The International Finance Corporation, private sector arm of the World Bank, has a definition. Again, there's some bank jargon, some IFC jargon. Cumulative effects are impacts that result from the incremental effect on areas or resources, on valued components, is what I would have said, from existing, planned, or reasonably defined developments, past, present, and future activities. And that's the IFC definition. The World Bank definition, again, cumulative impact of the project. This is a project impact assessment. Cumulative impact of the project is the incremental effect of the project when added to the impacts of other relevant past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future developments. I wanted to stress that the definition that I've used is the one that the World Bank uses, the one that the International Finance Corporation uses, and the one that's used in the Impact Assessment Act of Canada.
I don't intend to dwell too long on the introductions, but there's a bit of housekeeping that we need to take care of before I begin. The first is, first off, very important to say thank you. I want to thank the team at the Sustainable Development Institute for inviting me here to discuss what we're working on. I want to thank also Professor Ross for his initial presentation. Of course, what I want to say in relation to Mr. Ross's presentation and the questions that ensued is I hope that my presentation will give you more food for thought, and then we can really continue in those discussions. Like Professor Ross mentioned, I agree wholeheartedly. I have a disdain for jargon, but unfortunately, you'll see throughout my presentation, I do use some jargon. We'll try to get over that, and I ask for your forgiveness for that. The other element of housekeeping before I really get into it is you may remember in December 2019 I provided a presentation to the Institute on the 7 projects. We developed a report. We also had a workshop with the various committees that operate under our environmental assessment procedure. That report is publicly available, and in discussing with Noémie, I think what's really de jour is to maybe go a bit beyond that. That report and that work offered more or less a snapshot of the project level assessment of cumulative effects in the context of the JBNQA, in the James Bay territory specifically, not in Nunavik. It offered some, I guess you could say, constats, the identification of certain issues that warranted further thought, things like directives or terms of reference for the environmental assessment, the selection of valued components, and various other things. Today, that's been a while. Today, I don't want to dwell too long on those things. We've actually proceeded with a different kind of work since then that I think is really most interesting to all of you here on the call. And that's what my presentation is built around. In essence, what we realized over the course of our work previously on the 7 projects, and since then, is that we really need to take stock. Before we go any further, we need to take stock of the issues and challenges that, that really are facing us as practitioners, as scholars, with regards to cumulative effects and their management, and determine as a committee, and I'm going to get into that shortly, what we can actually do. I want to highlight the word solutions because we really, really want to start focusing on solutions. And I'll tell you why as I proceed through my presentation. So without further ado, these are the questions that we were mandated to answer as a committee from our members. Now, the James Bay Advisory Committee is a committee that was created under the James Bay Convention, which deals specifically with the James Bay area of applications, not in Nunavik. And we are a forum, a tripartite forum that's formed by members that are appointed by the 3 governments, so the Cree Nation government, the federal government, and the Quebec provincial government. And we're a forum for the open exchange of ideas to improve the environmental protection regime. That includes the project level assessment procedure, which frankly, I don't think is really worth going into in depth right now. I think people on the call are familiar enough with the nuts and bolts of how generally an EA works, so I won't get into that, but we do provide recommendations to the signatory parties of our treaty on how to improve that procedure, which is what we're doing. And we also have a wider mandate to look at things like Professor Ross mentioned earlier, regional assessments, land use planning, all of these other tools or instruments that are at our disposal, we also can produce recommendations on those sorts of things. So as a committee, we're not bound by, we're not in a box where we can only work on EA. We can also work on policy development and various other things. And we were given by our members, when I say we, internally at the JBase, we create working groups. We call them subcommittees. And we've had a subcommittee on cumulative effects that has been sitting regularly since 2014. So we've been actively working on the issue. And our subcommittee was given a new mandate because all of the work that we've done to date has been very project level, like I mentioned. And we realized that we need to take a step back and really reassess our approach. And we were given these two questions. And this is what I'm really going to try to focus on. And hopefully, it may provide some answers to some of your previous questions, but also, enrich our discussion. First one is, well, what are the main issues? And the second one, obviously, for us as a committee that recommends things to the governments, what can we actually do as a committee that's warranted, that's practical, and that's feasible? And we've given ourselves a 5-year timeline. Now, I'm going to, just one last thing on the context here is, again, I've already kind of mentioned it. So to rehash, though, we improve the Section 22 EA procedure. We look at regional policy. We try to make sure that the various regional level planning processes or assessments that may occur are coherent with our regime, evidently. And within our own strategic planning orientations, we've identified cumulative effects as a priority issue. So this is why we're here today. Now our approach, I've already touched on some elements of it, is we had quite a few, how would I put it, items that were highlighted in our previous work on our 7 projects. We're building on that, and I will show that to you in the upcoming slide on what I mean. But here I'll just, for the first bullet, I'll give you some examples. We know that when a proponent does an EA, he does it according to the instructions that he receives from the government. We call these things directives. Federal governments use several different terminologies, terms of reference, etc. It's the same idea, same document, the marching orders. We know that is a crucial element in the EA. And there were several things that were highlighted in relation to our procedure at this level of the formulation of directives that warranted a certain amount of attention. Aboriginal, Cree input in the development of the various methodologies or expectations that are required of the proponent. Consultation, various other facets that would be an avenue to have cumulative effects really on the agenda front and center in the directives were highlighted as areas for work. So we're building on that now. That's an example. Another element that was highlighted also is data, baseline data, and methodology. Currently, in our neck of the woods, under our procedure, proponents have a rather large, how would I put it, they have the discretion really to determine the methodologies that they wish to use when it comes to modeling cumulative effects. They justify them in their EISs, evidently, but still we wanted to look at that aspect there as well, and that was also highlighted in the reports. So we're building on that, and we're using all of that information that we've accumulated with our new reflections that we've had since then. And then, like I said earlier, is we had to we basically put a stop on our work for a moment for I would say, an opportunity really to reevaluate exactly what we're doing. And we realized that what we need to do is really pick apart the problems that really contribute to our ability to assess and then manage cumulative effects, and really identify where we can bring solutions or ameliorative recommendations, and basically at both the project and regional level. And then from there, internally, the JBase would then be able to make a sober identification or targeting of where we want to really put our efforts. Now, over the course of all of this, and I know I'm holding back here, guys, I really want to start getting into the issues and challenges that we've identified. But over the course of the past few years, we identified a few fundamental issues that are facing the community, not just EA practitioners, but decision makers, planners, citizens, that contribute to this dilemma that we're in when it comes to making sure that our glass of water is clear to drink. And it's a term that we've seen in the literature that's called wicked problems. One could argue that cumulative effects pose a wicked problem like climate change. There's so many factors. There's so much to unpack that it creates certain issues conceptually, philosophically, legally, and morally that we can't discount. And these are by no means exhaustive. But we've realized that when we're attacking the issue of how can we do a better job at assessing and managing cumulative effects, we're immediately faced with these three fundamental issues. And the first one is in essence, different assessment and decision-making perspectives. I'm going to get into it further, but the assessment of cumulative effects, I think we could all agree, requires a holistic assessment perspective. And that poses some serious challenges for us. Scientifically speaking, for example, we are specialty focused. At a governance level, for example, we operate in specific ministries. We don't necessarily communicate all that well. Now, keep in mind, I work for the governments, for the three governments. So this is without prejudice, what I'm saying. It is the way we operate. We have to admit that. So different perspectives on approaching these problems are required. Evidently, First Nation perspectives on these. First Nation peoples have developed a very unique connection with the land and have learned to interpret cumulative change in a different way that, for example, I have given my background. And so these sorts of refreshing different assessment perspectives need to be seriously considered. The other issue that we see, and it's similar to the issue that we have with climate change, is simply the scope of the issues. These are complex issues. Cumulative effects, the way they operate, the way we assess them, and then the way, of course, we try to manage them is a complex issue. And complexity breeds what has been coined in the literature, a certain amount of scoping paralysis, where, for example, any one actor might see it rather difficult to do something that could really contribute to a solution for the main problem. So some people, decision makers, governments, practitioners can feel powerless in certain situations to do something meaningful. And I think we can all agree that this is more or less a generality here that we're faced when it comes to these sorts of big questions or wicked problems. The other issue here, and let's just evacuate this almost immediately from our discussion, is blurred grounds for responsibility. At a project level, at a legal level, the polluter pays principle establishes very clear grounds through which we can hold polluters responsible for the consequences of their actions. So, you know, proponents that pollute evidently are responsible. Our legal construct, our legal framework is built around that, and that's clear. On the other side, governments, decision makers, based on that principle, have the power to legislate and regulate and can make decisions based on the information they obtain. What happens, though, when we start moving forward into cumulative effects, and again, this doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have avenues out of this, but at the current moment, once we start talking about cumulative effects, we see the limits of responsibility getting fuzzier and fuzzier. And that's for proponents in a sense. Once we start expanding into a discussion about regional cumulative effects, once we start talking about past projects, but also for legislators and decision makers, a simple example is simply the fact that in some cases, ministries don't necessarily talk openly with each other. Also, the various layers of government, so, you know, national, provincial, municipal, and then, even at a community level, we see shifting, I guess you could say, shifting responsibilities with regards to who does what. So these are the sorts of things that we're faced with when these fundamental issues. And for us at the J-Base, when we put pen to paper and we started, amassing all of this, we realized that at least for the moment, these elements are higher order elements for which we're not at the J-Base, we're poorly equipped to deal with immediately. But I think it's really worth spending the time to at least highlight that we have these issues here. We need to keep them in the back of our minds. Now, without further ado, I'm going to try to get to the fruit of my work, okay? At least since I would say 2018. What you're seeing here, and I'm going to change the screen shortly, I'm also going to mention, I'm just going to take a step back here and mention that the document that all my presentation is based on currently is not public. It's a working document. Our subcommittee has yet to sit for a meeting, which should occur shortly. And one of the issues I'm going to ask them is authorization to share with you the document, which shouldn't pose a problem at all. But I just need to follow the chain of command, folks. And upon authorization, I'll surely send this to you because it's much clearer in our document. Of course, it's a much longer document as well. So what we had to do, like I say, is tease out all of the problems, the challenges, the issues that are facing us with regards to cumulative effects assessment, and then determine, where we can actually do something. And the pie chart here just breaks it up according to how the EA procedure works, at least the way we see it in the James Bay territory. So we have on the left, upper left is the project CIA. Sorry, I'm into the jargon now, guys. That's cumulative effect assessment. And here what we mean is the cumulative effect assessment that's the component of a project EA in the upper left. So proponents are involved, regulators are involved. In our neck of the woods, the evaluating committee and the review committees, COMEV, COMEX, and COFEX are involved. On the right, upper right, the project authorization process, which is in the hands of the regulators, in our case, the administrators who decide on whether or not a specific project should proceed, and if so, under what conditions. That's that space that occupies the upper right. The lower two quadrants in blue basically are the regional level issues. The regional planning at the bottom left quadrant is what we understand internally as those higher order assessments, so regional impact assessments, land use planning, forest management planning. Those sorts of exercises occupy the space at the lower left. And on the lower right is a regional policy, which I'm going to touch on momentarily. So here is actually the page in our document, which I intend to share with you all. You'll see what we did is, you won't be able to see, it's, I'm sure, rather small. But in essence, the idea here is just so that you get a feeling for what we did, is each quadrant basically was hashed out. And we established the main issues and challenges that are facing decision makers, proponents, etc., when it comes to cumulative effect assessment across the various quadrants that we've teased out per our mandate. Just quickly, you can't see this, I apologize, but for project level SIA, so within the EA procedure, we know that, again, there's unclear roles, there's methodological challenges, things like baseline data availability. It's hard to get data, it's expensive to get new data. That all poses challenges. There's no permanent institution in the James Bay territory that actually is mandated as a third party to govern the data that is available, to ensure its use is robust and rigorous and credible. We also, like I mentioned quickly, the directives, for example, are inconsistent. So if you look at the directives that have been issued over time under Section 22, you'll see different requirements with regards to what proponents need to do. You'll see different temporal requirements, different marching orders when it comes to what they need to include in their impact statements. Another issue, of course, is the need to include First Nation input in the development, all of that. And that poses unique issues. I'm not saying that it's a problem. We do have consultations, but there's issues there to be looked at. And the elephant in the room, at least in our case, and I'm sure it's the same elsewhere, is major projects, massive projects. So at the project level assessment, these projects pose serious challenges when it comes to evaluating their cumulative effects. Large multi-phase projects basically require special attention. Their impacts are so, well, they pose unique challenges, right? Their impacts, the intensity of their impacts, the longevity, the frequency can vary widely over time and space. In some cases, major projects can set new baselines. There was a previous question about the temporal limits to cumulative effects. For example, in the James Bay territory with these rather large hydroelectric projects that were constructed in the early 70s, the debate could be made, what's the baseline? Should the baseline be 1975, for example? Should the baseline be pre-1975? So these are some of the issues and challenges that are facing proponents and regulators at the project level assessment phase. Now, in our document, we further teased out what you see in the upper left text box. And so I really hope to send that to you, this document to you after our meeting. At the upper right, basically we've done the same thing. We've teased out the issues for the project authorization phase. And here, in addition to what I've just mentioned with regards to the assessment phase, we've added a few other points. We noticed that mitigators have problems. Mitigators have problems because sometimes there's limited room to mitigate due to technological constraints, design constraints, alternative scenario constraints. A mine can only be developed where there's minerals. So there's issues like that have to be faced. There's also, and this is of course without prejudice, but there's a limited ability to impose conditions that in some cases exceed the project scope. So what I mean by that is I'll give you an example. In the Chibougamau area, there was a lot of mining in the early 50s. Those mines closed. Of course, at the time, the requirements for mine closure are more similar to abandonment. And now we have issues there. A lot of these proponents are no longer in business. They don't exist anymore. The land has actually been retroceded to the state. A proponent now that wants to set up and follow the rules, what do we do? How do we organize? How do we decide in a manner that accounts for the new project, but also accounts for this latent issue for which that new proponent is not necessarily responsible? There's also the temporal issue. In essence, legislators or decision makers have a problem deciding when issues might exceed the project scale. The other issue that we noticed that has to be mentioned is that at the decision-making level, when we're talking about projects at the project scale, they need to have a very thorough understanding of what's going on in the area. And that includes even minor projects that are not subject to EA. And currently, one of the limitations with our regime is that proponents are relied upon to identify all of that in their impact study. So there's no, there's not like one singular centralized area where we know exactly what's going on and then decisions can be made based on that. We really are relying on proponents. And finally, when we have areas where there's a high concentration of development, well, again, a decision maker has challenges. And here, thank you, Professor Ross. Collaboration, discussion, in essence, is a potential way out. And I'm going to touch on that shortly. At the regional level, bottom left quadrant, and I'll go quickly. For the moment, at the planning process, so when I say the word plan, I'm talking about forest management plans, regional land use plans, regional impact assessments. For the moment, we don't have an explicit requirement to include cumulative effect assessment in, for example, a forest management plan. So there's a serious challenge there. Another issue is we have shifting baselines, temporal metrics, and resiliency. We can't ever forget that there's a lag in an action that we do at a regional level now. There's a lag in the actions that we pose now and when the expression of those cumulative effects will come out. The other thing too, in our experience, is the Cree communities are very resilient to change. They have proven this for millennia. And so what is the significance of a cumulative change on the Cree way of life is a challenge to address at a regional level now. In terms of modeling, well, it's the same at the project level. It's very hard to predict the future, folks. I think we can all agree. And at a regional level, for the moment, we don't necessarily have land use plans that are developed yet. So we're also lacking in the orientations and the desired trajectories for what we want to see on the landscape. The other element here is, despite all of these really, really interesting analytical frameworks that are now coming up, our problem, at least right now, is that they remain rather academic. It's without prejudice here, folks. And we don't know at the moment exactly how all of this is going to work. We don't have a clear understanding of the desired contexts in which projects are really going to occur on the landscape. And so we need to work more at that modeling and that analytical, perspective. Now, at the regional policy, so at bottom right, basically, I have very little to say, folks. We do not have a regional policy. The work that we're doing at the J-Base, we hope will work towards the development of that. Finally, for this really busy diagram, it's just the links between everything. The links, we can't forget that there should be a feedback loop. Regional planning should feed into project planning. Project planning should then feed into regional planning. That's what you see in the yellow and the red box on your screen. Those issues are yet to be resolved, and they're kind of on their own. How do we link up these two solitudes, regional planning and project planning? So we need to work on that too. Now, enough with this negative look at things. I want to get into action and solutions. And I'll be quick because I think that was a big chunk, and I think we're all tired, and you might want to ask me some questions. We had a special meeting in December, so this is really fresh off the press, and we've decided as a committee now that we want to work on this. We think that we actually can bring some practical recommendations on these specific issues that we identified over the course of our diagnostic, which I very briefly highlighted for you previously. The first is data. We think that one of the areas that we can really do some work is encouraging the development of a centralized information portal. I'm going to say portal. I don't know what format it will take. But we think this would be a really interesting avenue to pursue. We think that a baseline information portal would be best tool to ensure rigor, use, credible use of the data that is available, and also be, I guess you could say, a forum for the discussion and establishment of thresholds that are unique for the territory. And so to do this is, first off, our role, being a tripartite body under our treaty, is to really encourage collaboration between the governments. So we need to start discussing this with them. And we really need, like I say, to explore the development of this centralized information portal. And we think that if an institution could be mandated to ensure, that data is managed, it's shared, we think that that would be a good avenue, the start, to really start addressing cumulative effects and how they interact on the territory. The next thing is the directives. So again, now I'm really building on the work that we've done previously at the project level. The directives, the instructions are powerful. They tell proponents what to do. So we're going to lean on our members, our federal members indeed, and try to deepen our understanding of the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada's, formerly the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency of Canada's experience with their methodology. We also want to identify, and now this is of course in collaboration with the entities, the review bodies under our procedure, EA procedure. We want to identify those orientations now that are in the directives that improve knowledge of the project areas. So this is linked to the previous solution which we see, which is data, having data available. We want to encourage that and see what we can do to improve that in the directives. We also want to have more, or at least support more, First Nation involvement in the concoction or the drafting of these directives. Specifically, what valued components are selected, what constitutes a project area. That's a very important thing. I know there was a previous question about temporal limits at a project level. There's also what's the region? What's this area under study? Is it the mine and its immediate, I don't know, a 500-meter radius around it? Most probably not. What should be the region? And so we need to discuss that, and we need to see what we can do across the various different types of projects that frequently occur in our neck of the woods. Evidently, a hydro project, its project study area would be rather large in comparison to a mine. We want to get more familiar with that and see if we can come up with recommendations with regards to that. Professor Ross touched on it at the end of his presentation. We also want to see what we can do to attack several of the problems I mentioned. A concentration of development in a given sector, for example, requires a degree of collaboration. And we want to see what we can do to insert collaboration at that level in the directives now and make it an obligation. And of course, evidently, we're going to need to sit down with a lot of people to do this work on the directives. I've only included the evaluating and review bodies under Section 22 of the JBNQA here, but evidently we'll be discussing with the agency, the ministry, the provincial ministry, etc. Regional planning. Now, we had to look long and hard at this issue. So I'm in the bottom left quadrant of our diagram here. The JBase is not a planning body. In essence, we're an oversight advisory body. We don't do the planning, in essence. We stay aware of it. So it is more or less at the margin of our mandate. But so although we won't be suggesting necessarily a methodology on how, for example, a land use plan or a forest management plan should be done to consider cumulative effects, we think that we need to seize the opportunity because the time is nigh. Cumulative effects are on everybody's agenda, it seems. And we want to enrich our understanding. So we need to sit down with the planning bodies and we want to see who does what, when, and how. What is the status of their consideration of value components, for example, in the various planning instruments that they work on? And if so, if not, well, why? And if so, how? And work from there. Now, the problem with this here, for us, and it's a mechanistic problem, is a lot of the land use plans in the James Bay territory have yet to be developed. They're in development. And so we really need to determine how we're going to approach this issue. And so we're going to be developing a strategy for this element here with the planners, the various planners. And now, you know, this is kind of the last thing on the slide here is basically just a disclaimer for what I mentioned earlier. We're really going to focus our efforts immediately on the project level for the moment. We think we have, if we can just tackle items number 1 and 2, we would be quite happy. They're huge, but that doesn't mean we can't work on the regional planning at the same time. But for the moment, we really just want to sit down with the planners and see where they're at. Last but not least is the policy. I know a lot of people, the DFO, for example, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Professor Ross mentioned it as well, the Impact Agency of Canada, Transport Canada, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of groups are working on what we could call policy, cumulative effect assessment policy. The thing I want to mention here, though, is that I'm really focused, when I say regional policy, we're focused on a policy for the James Bay territory. So that's why I can say that we don't have one yet. We have a role to play here as a committee, and we think that we really need to attack the project level issues, the project authorization issues, and the regional planning issues before we can really turn our attention to the development of a regional policy. We think that it's going to be an iterative process. We're going to need to go through items 1 through 3 before we can really attack number 4 with any degree of comfort. In essence, what I mean by comfort is we need to base what we do at the policy level on good science, and when I say science, I include, of course, the Cree traditional knowledge and the Cree way of life. We want to include that in our reflection on those work on items 1 through 3. And with that, we'll be better tooled to really come up with something meaningful with regards to a policy.
Donc, ce que je vais vous présenter aujourd'hui, essentiellement, fait partie, chevauche les travaux de thèse que j'ai faits et les projets qui sont présentement en cours maintenant que j'ai terminé ma thèse comme que je suis rendu stagiaire postdoctoral. J'ai juste commencé un peu avec une mise en contexte pour dire un peu de où je viens puis pourquoi je vous présente ça aujourd'hui. Finalement, mon expertise de base, je suis un écologiste. Mes travaux ont toujours été centrés davantage sur les interactions entre les espèces et les humains, la conservation et la gestion, l'évaluation de milieux d'intérêt pour l'établissement d'aires marines protégées, ce genre de trucs-là. Donc, vraiment, un aspect davantage environnemental, écologique. Donc, j'ai très peu d'expérience pour tout ce qui est côté législatif et politique. Mon expérience n'a pas été basée sur les processus d'évaluation d'impact environnementaux, puis je commence à faire l'intégration explicite de dimensions humaines dans mes travaux. Donc, quand j'ai commencé finalement à m'intéresser aux évaluations d'effets cumulatifs, je l'ai fait davantage d'un point de vue de gestion écosystémique et non de processus d'évaluation d'impact environnementaux. Donc, c'est un peu ça un peu pour mettre la table de ce que je vais vous présenter aujourd'hui. Donc, pour parler des effets cumulatifs, je vais commencer par vous présenter un peu ce que j'entends par perspective écosystémique et comment on arrive finalement à faire notre évaluation d'effets cumulatifs de façon assez simplifiée. Ensuite, je vais vous présenter un cas d'étude de résultats d'analyse pour le système du Saint-Laurent. Ensuite, brièvement, un projet pilote sur les activités maritimes qu'on fait avec Transport Canada présentement. Et ensuite, je vais parler du défi de gestion de connaissances qu'on vient d'aborder avec M. Morin. Puis quand je parle de gestion de connaissances, je parle de connaissances at large, si on vient de parler de données, évidemment, mais il y a plusieurs types de connaissances différentes. Donc, j'utilise le terme gestion de connaissances un peu plus large que simplement données, mais on pourrait parler de données aussi. Donc, pour commencer, très brièvement, ce que j'entends par gestion écosystémique, c'est des processus qui sont d'évaluation, de suivi, de monitoring qui sont davantage faits à l'échelle écosystémique et qui s'intéressent finalement aux interactions et aux processus écologiques qui sont nécessaires pour maintenir la composition, la structure et la fonction des écosystèmes. Je ne présenterai pas les définitions d'effets cumulatifs, je vais juste les rapporter ici, ils ont déjà été présentés. Je pense qu'on peut facilement voir en termes de gestion écosystémique, l'évaluation des effets cumulatifs est souvent citée, mais si on s'intéresse aux processus spécifiques, les évaluations d'effets cumulatifs par projet, je pense que c'est évident qu'ils ne touchent pas réellement la gestion écosystémique. Puis finalement, l'évaluation régionale qu'on a vue également s'y rapproche davantage sans nécessairement être de la gestion écosystémique, mais c'est un pas majeur vers cette direction-là, mais le gouvernement présentement est en train de se doter d'une capacité pour être capable de faire davantage d'évaluation régionale et stratégique. Donc, on n'est pas tout à fait encore là, mais on y arrive. Donc, ce que je vais vous présenter ici, c'est un peu une vision conceptuelle de comment on peut faire une évaluation d'effets cumulatifs sur un écosystème. Donc, ici, je vous présente essentiellement un écosystème qui est très simple, où on aurait, par exemple, 3 sources de stress qui seraient des anomalies de température reliées au changement climatique, la navigation et la pêcherie, et une série d'espèces qui se retrouvent dans ce système-là. Donc, de façon très simple, on peut décortiquer le problème en regardant finalement les effets d'un stresseur, ici la température, sur une espèce. Et si on fait ça en termes spatial, ce qu'on aurait essentiellement, c'est une cartographie de notre facteur de stress, une cartographie de notre composante valorisée, qui est l'espèce ici, la vulnérabilité pour être capable d'obtenir finalement une cartographie de l'effet où on peut parler de risque ici associé à ce facteur de stress, à cette composante valorisée. Et le jeu, finalement, c'est d'être capable de l'explorer l'ensemble des combinaisons possibles, stresseurs, espèces, pour être capable de faire finalement une caractérisation exhaustive de notre milieu pour en faire une évaluation d'effets cumulatifs. Donc, ce qu'on voit ici, par exemple, sur la ligne, c'est une cartographie des différents facteurs de stress dans un milieu fictif, évidemment. Ici, ce qu'on a, c'est une cartographie des composantes valorisées. Donc, on cherche à aller faire une cartographie des effets individuels pour chacune des combinaisons possibles pour ultimement réussir à obtenir une évaluation d'impact cumulée qui intègre l'ensemble de ces facteurs-là pour une région donnée. Donc, ça, c'est une méthode qui a été publiée en 2008, qui a été remise à jour en 2015 et récemment en 2019 à l'échelle globale. Donc, ici, c'est un peu ce qu'on voit là. En haut à gauche, ce sont les résultats de 2008 sur les océans qui ont permis de mettre en lien finalement, je pense que c'est 17 sources de stress différents avec une quinzaine d'habitats différents. Un peu partout sur les océans globaux pour aller voir finalement les milieux qui étaient les plus à risque des stresseurs cumulés. Puis ici, c'est la même évaluation faite en 2013 et finalement, ici, c'est le changement de risque cumulé, si on veut, d'effets cumulatifs d'une période à l'autre. Et donc, ce que cet exercice-là a permis de démontrer, premièrement, c'est que la majorité des océans sont soumis aux effets cumulatifs de plusieurs sources de stress, que les sources de stress continuent d'augmenter, mais nous a aussi permis aussi mis en place une méthode qui est relativement simple pour être capable de prendre en considération finalement la complexité des écosystèmes pour en faire une évaluation d'effets cumulatifs avec une perspective davantage écosystémique. Donc, nous, finalement, on a repris cette méthode-là pour l'appliquer au système du Saint-Laurent, donc plus spécifiquement l'estuaire et le golfe du Saint-Laurent. Dans le cadre de ma thèse, j'ai quand même poussé davantage la réflexion et développé la méthodologie. Ce que je vais vous présenter aujourd'hui, je le fais dans le cadre de la méthode que je viens de vous présenter. Si il y a des questions sur ce qu'on a fait par là, ça va me faire plaisir d'y répondre. Donc, je parlais plutôt de caractériser les stresseurs. On a effectué une caractérisation des différents stresseurs environnementaux pour un total de 18 stresseurs, dont 6 d'origine climatique, dont par exemple l'acidification des océans, l'hypoxie, les anomalies de température, 5 stresseurs d'origine terrestre comme le développement côtier, la pollution organique, inorganique, différents types de pêcherie et différents éléments de la navigation maritime. Et on a essentiellement choisi comme composantes valorisées les différentes espèces de poissons et invertébrés et mammifères marins dans le système pour un total de 193 espèces. Donc, ça nous fait finalement une évaluation qui considère 18 stresseurs différents et 193 espèces dans notre système. Et en appliquant finalement cette méthode-là que je viens de vous présenter, ça nous a permis d'obtenir une évaluation d'effets cumulatifs à l'échelle du Saint-Laurent au complet et identifier les milieux qui sont les plus, de façon générale finalement, les milieux qui sont les plus à risque des stresseurs cumulés, comme pour, par exemple, ici observer que l'estuaire du Saint-Laurent, comparativement au reste du Golfe, est beaucoup plus soumis, beaucoup plus à risque des stresseurs cumulés, surtout en milieu côtier. Donc ça, j'entrerai pas trop dans les détails, encore une fois, on peut y revenir, mais c'est un des outputs, des résultats qu'on obtient de cette analyse-là. Mais ce qui est intéressant aussi, c'est qu'on est capable d'aller beaucoup plus en détail pour extraire des portions un peu plus on va dire fines de l'analyse, comme par exemple ici, je pourrais regarder uniquement les résultats sur les poissons de fond, uniquement sur l'ensemble des stresseurs, et je pourrais faire ça pour l'ensemble des combinaisons, soit individuelles ou en groupe dans le système. Et finalement, un truc qui est intéressant ici, c'est ce que ça nous permet de faire également, c'est en un coup d'œil aller voir ce qu'on appelle des séquences d'effets. Donc, aller voir finalement c'est quoi les liens entre les différents stresseurs et les espèces et caractériser le risque associé à chaque stresseur et pour chaque espèce. Donc, essentiellement, ce qu'on peut faire, c'est ici ce qu'on voit sur la figure en haut à droite, ce sont les différents stresseurs qu'on a pris en considération. Ensuite, de l'autre côté, ce sont toutes les espèces qu'on a pris en considération. Et si on décide finalement de tirer sur un nœud dans cette visualisation de réseau-là, on est capable d'aller voir, le nœud est affecté par quel stresseur. et en quelle proportion. Alors maintenant, je vais passer au projet pilote qu'on est en train de mettre sur lequel on est en train de travailler. En fait, pour dire aussi, juste avant de finir, ce projet-là, on l'a terminé pour le Saint-Laurent, puis on est en train aussi de le mettre en place présentement pour la côte atlantique, donc la baie de Fundy et la biorégion finalement du plateau néo-écossais. On fait également, comme j'ai dit, un projet pilote sur les activités maritimes avec Transport Canada. Donc, brièvement, ça, c'est un projet qui, à l'échelle nationale, a été lancé dans le cadre du plan de protection des océans. Je crois qu'il y a plusieurs personnes qui sont présentes ici aujourd'hui qui sont impliquées dans ce projet-là. Donc, de façon très générale, le projet avait 4 objectifs qui étaient de développer un cadre et une méthodologie d'évaluation des effets cumulatifs, de collecter les données pour effectuer des analyses, faire des évaluations régionales des effets cumulatifs et ensuite donner des recommandations pour des stratégies d'atténuation des effets cumulatifs. La figure que je présente ici en bas, ce sont comment ces objectifs-là se sont divisés comment Transport Canada a divisé l'atteinte de ces objectifs-là en 4 phases différentes. Et Transport Canada a vraiment mis l'importance finalement tout au long de ce processus-là sur le développement de partenariats, de mobilisation et le développement de collaboration pour impliquer beaucoup de parties prenantes dans le projet et principalement également les Premières Nations. Donc, présentement, on est davantage, Transport Canada est davantage dans la phase 3 du projet. Donc, ils viennent de déposer une ébauche du cadre national pour l'évaluation des effets cumulatifs du transport maritime. Je ne passerai pas à travers tous les éléments, mais essentiellement, ils ont comme divisé le cadre en 6 étapes différentes qui commencent par de la mobilisation et de la planification, passent ensuite à l'établissement de la portée du projet, l'évaluation d'effets cumulatifs, prise de décision, l'exécution et l'évaluation et les réactions, donc le processus de consultation à la fin qui permet de mettre en place une gestion adaptative et revenir finalement plus tôt dans le projet. Et tout au long de ce projet, de ce framework-là, ils mettent l'emphase sur la mobilisation et la collaboration. Donc, pour ce projet-là, ils ont identifié 6 régions pilotes pour faire des évaluations régionales, dont 2 en Colombie-Britannique, 1 au Nunavut et 3 dans l'Est du Canada. Et finalement, ce que je vais vous parler brièvement aujourd'hui, le projet dans lequel nous, on est impliqués, c'est le projet qui prend place dans le fleuve du Saint-Laurent, qui est entre essentiellement Montréal et Pointe-des-Monts, donc la portion fluviale du Saint-Laurent et la portion de l'estuaire jusqu'à l'entrée du Golfe. Donc, il y a eu beaucoup de travail qui a été fait par Transport Canada en collaboration avec le gouvernement du Québec dans le cadre du plan Saint-Laurent pour effectuer cette évaluation régionale-là. Donc, il y a des Premières Nations, les communautés Abénaquis, Huron-Wendat, Malé-Sipemok et nous qui sont impliqués dans ce projet-là, divers intervenants locaux et plusieurs organisations non gouvernementales. Et à travers les différents processus de collaboration et de mobilisation, ils ont identifié finalement la portée de ce projet-là qui est spécifiquement sur les activités maritimes. Donc, il y a une série de 7 stresseurs environnementaux qui ont été identifiés pour l'analyse. Et avec des processus de consultation, il y a aussi 5 composantes valorisées différentes qui ont été identifiées sur laquelle l'analyse d'effets cumulatifs devrait être faite. Donc, des sites d'importance, si on parle de sites d'importance pour la culture, l'archéologie, pour les Premières Nations, ensuite différents types d'habitats, la qualité de l'eau, les mammifères marins et l'intégrité des berges, qui ont été essentiellement les composantes valorisées qui ont été identifiées par les communautés comme étant les plus importantes. Et finalement, dans le fond, c'est tout le travail en amont que Transport Canada a donné. Et présentement, nous, notre équipe, on travaille sur l'évaluation biophysique qui est pratiquement en cours. On est en train de rassembler les données biophysiques, mais également à travailler avec les Premières Nations pour rassembler les connaissances nécessaires pour faire l'évaluation. Donc, ça, c'est présentement en cours. Puis, dans le fond, on va appliquer le même genre d'approche que ce que j'ai présenté un peu plus tôt. Et il y a aussi un contrat pour une analyse plus davantage socio-culturelle, désolé, pour les communautés autochtones qui est présentement en cours, qui vient tout juste de commencer dans le cadre de ce projet. Alors maintenant, je prendrai le temps, en fait, de revenir sur le défi de gestion des connaissances qui a été discuté déjà un peu plus tôt. Mais j'aimerais y revenir un peu plus. Donc, dans le cadre d'évaluation d'effets cumulatifs et surtout dans un contexte écosystémique, un des défis de taille, c'est la quantité considérable de connaissances qui sont requises pour effectuer les évaluations. Donc, typiquement, les différentes connaissances, les différentes données vont être détenues par une diversité d'experts disciplinaires avec qui on doit passer un temps très important à essentiellement rechercher de l'information, développer des collaborations et mettre en forme des connaissances pour qu'on soit capable de faire une évaluation, bâtir une base de données commune et faire une évaluation d'effets cumulatifs. Et un des défis, finalement, qui a été énoncé déjà plus tôt, c'est de chercher essentiellement à faciliter la réutilisation et les utilisations secondaires des connaissances qui sont déjà existantes. Évidemment, le point on parle souvent de portail de données, on parle, présentement, c'est très, très à la mode de parler de ça, c'est le mouvement qui est en train d'être pris vers le partage ouvert des connaissances, qui représente une solution, une des solutions les plus importantes pour être capable de faciliter et d'optimiser l'adoption, je veux dire, d'évaluation d'effets cumulatifs, mais également d'approche holistique plus en général. Donc, un exemple d'archivage et d'accès en ligne est l'OGSL, qui est un site qui partage des données et qui développe des partenariats davantage en milieu marin. Et les avantages, finalement, des connaissances ouvertes, c'est d'assurer une reproductibilité des travaux, une transparence plus grande, augmenter l'efficacité, optimiser les investissements pour pas dépenser de l'argent, finalement, pour aller chercher des données qui existent déjà. Ça permet de valoriser les connaissances et ça permet aussi de développer des collaborations plus facilement quand on sait ce qui est disponible comme données, finalement. Ici, je peux donner un exemple qu'on a développé dans le cadre du projet dans le système du Saint-Laurent qui s'appelle eDrivers, qui est une initiative de partage de connaissances sur les stresseurs. Donc, essentiellement, c'est une plateforme de connaissances ouvertes qui partage les 18 sources de stresseurs qu'on a caractérisées dans le cadre du premier projet. Et l'objectif de ce projet-là, plus largement, est de créer une communauté d'experts qui est commis à structurer, partager et standardiser les connaissances sur les stresseurs dans le Saint-Laurent. Puis l'objectif à long terme, évidemment, c'est aussi de non seulement partager les connaissances sur les stresseurs, mais également les connaissances sur les composantes valorisées et l'évaluation d'effets cumulatifs qui en découlent. Un autre exemple, je ne m'attarderai pas là-dessus, mais je trouvais important de mentionner, donner l'exemple de l'Atlas de la gamme qui est disponible en ligne et qui fournit une très grande quantité de connaissances qui sont très intéressantes sur le Saint-Laurent. Par contre, je pense que c'est important de faire le point et de reconnaître qu'il n'y a pas uniquement des avantages avec les connaissances ouvertes. Il y a des désavantages ou plutôt, on va dire, des risques potentiels qui sont que les utilisateurs secondaires en fassent un mauvais usage, en fassent une mauvaise interprétation, qu'il y ait une absence d'attribution appropriée, donc que les générateurs des connaissances primaires ne soient pas correctement reconnus pour leur travail. Ça peut limiter le partage des bénéfices et donc ça doit être accompagné avec des bonnes pratiques de gestion de données. Puis, il y a des principes qui existent, qui cherchent à adresser ces lacunes-là. Le premier, c'est les principes FAIR qui visent à rendre les données découvrables, accessibles, interopérables, réutilisables. Je ne rentrerai pas dans les détails de ça. Je vais expliquer pourquoi un peu après, je les présente, mais ces principes-là sont orientés davantage sur les données et non les personnes et les usages derrière. Et visent à améliorer les pratiques et la structure de nos gestions de données pour favoriser la réutilisation des connaissances qui existent déjà et qui sont partagées. Et je présente également les principes CARE qui sont davantage orientés sur les personnes et les objectifs et qui ont comme objectif principal la protection des droits et de la gouvernance des données des Premières Nations. Alors, CARE, c'est pour bénéfice collectif, autorité de contrôler, responsabilité et éthique. Ce sont des principes qui sont inspirés, entre autres, des principes du PCAP et des Premières Nations. Et l'objectif, finalement, de ces principes-là, c'est d'offrir un complément aux principes FAIR que je viens de présenter et s'assurer que les connaissances qui sont partagées sont FAIR and CARE. Donc, l'objectif que j'ai derrière à vous présenter ces principes-là, c'est pas de se perdre dans les aspects techniques de tout ça, mais bien de montrer que, parce qu'en fait, moi-même, je connais bien les principes FAIR, mais les principes CARE, présentement, je connais rien. C'est quelque chose qui a été publié à l'automne de cette année, donc c'est quelque chose qui est très récent. J'ai pas de connaissances là-dedans. Je vais faire mon mea culpa, entre autres d'ailleurs aussi. Je suis inscrit présentement au cours pour en apprendre davantage sur les principes du PCAP pour devenir plus familier finalement avec tout ça. Mais bref, mon objectif derrière tout ça, c'était juste de montrer que il y a des principes qui existent. Il y a un souci présentement qui est attribué à la protection des droits et la gouvernance des données des Premières Nations. Et c'est un bon moment d'avoir ces conversations-là pour s'assurer qu'on est capable de mettre à profit les connaissances qui existent dans les communautés, tout en respectant finalement les droits et la gouvernance. Et pourquoi j'en parle spécifiquement dans le contexte de l'évaluation des effets cumulatifs, c'est que typiquement, ce qu'on fait lors d'évaluation d'effets cumulatifs, on assume déjà qu'il y a une espèce de boucle de rétroaction entre l'évaluation et la gestion. Et la connaissance, la gestion des connaissances devient un élément de l'évaluation des effets cumulatifs. Ce que je propose ici, par contre, c'est de dissocier l'acquisition des connaissances au processus d'évaluation et de gestion pour être capable d'en assurer une plus grande efficacité, s'assurer qu'il y a une structure commune et une plus grande accessibilité. Puis l'objectif ici, c'est pas de diminuer la collaboration, la mobilisation et la consultation, qui au contraire doit continuer d'être centrale au processus d'évaluation des effets cumulatifs et à la gestion écosystémique en général. Mais c'est davantage d'être capable de structurer les connaissances pour passer plus de temps à discuter de gestion et d'évaluation plutôt que d'acquisition de connaissances et adresser essentiellement un peu ce que M. Morin discutait tout à l'heure de scoping paralysis. Je pense pas que ça va régler tout le problème, mais ça pourrait en adresser une partie. Donc, l'avantage derrière structurer les connaissances, c'est d'être capable d'avoir une meilleure, d'utiliser différents types de connaissances ensemble, mais surtout d'identifier les lacunes qu'on a beaucoup mieux au niveau des connaissances. Et je dois dire que particulièrement, de ma perspective, du moins du côté des évaluations qui sont davantage écosystémiques, les dimensions humaines sont particulièrement lacunaires pour l'évaluation des effets cumulatifs. Donc, l'idée ici serait de passer d'évaluation qui serait strictement environnementale, donc essentiellement le réseau que je vous ai présenté un peu plus tôt, issu de notre projet, vers des évaluations qui seraient capables d'inclure explicitement des considérations sociales, culturelles et économiques. Merci beaucoup.